On the bench today we have a Cobra 135 XLR. This is I don't want to say they're rare, but you definitely don't see many of these days. They're just not that many of them out there to be found. And they're really nice radios. So this is a 40 channel radio. This is not a 35 channel radio. Easy way to tell in this vintage, if the model number has XLR on the end, it's a 40 channel radio. If this was a Cobra 135, take the XLR off the end, then it would be a 23 channel radio. And that holds true for pretty much all of the Cobras around this time frame, all of the other radio models they made. They would have had the original version back when it was a 23 channel radio. Instead of just, honestly, they are completely different radios. The 135 and the 135 XLR are two completely different radios on the inside. May look the same on the outside other than the channel display, but internally, completely different circuit boards, just wholly different radios. And that's pretty much true for all of the different models. But like I say, that's an easy way to tell. If you see XLR on the end, you're pretty much guaranteed you've got a 40 channel radio. They just recycled the numbers and just added some letters onto the end, basically. They kept the same cabinets. But this one was sent in. It is a working radio. Customer just wants this one restored. He has an affinity for the clock in this, which I kind of find nice. And you'll see that after I get it flipped over. It's a flip clock, not a rotary dial clock. It's one of the ones where the numbers drop. And he wanted one like that, just because it's kind of retro and cool, and I think so too. He wanted it recapped. Basically he said, whatever it needs, do it. Well, it really didn't need much. It was a working radio, so basically just replace the electrolytic capacitors. Fortunately, that did get done, because some of the caps were starting to leak. I've already done that. I'm actually just getting ready to start the alignment as soon as I get done. And it's why I'm starting in kind of a weird place. There really wasn't a lot to show on this thing, because, like I said, I didn't really have to do any repairs. But I started here, and I'll get to that in a second, why I'm starting with the radio upside down and torn apart. But the electrolytic capacitors, some of those were starting to leak, and this is a double-sided circuit board, and it's an early double-sided circuit board. When the electrolytic capacitors start, and I don't mean internal leakage, where it's leaking voltage, so it's basically turning from a capacitor into a resistor. The leakage I'm talking about is the corrosive oil inside of the capacitor starts to leak out onto the circuit board, and it was starting to ooze out around the leads of a few of them, and some of the copper traces on top of the circuit board, directly underneath, because there are traces on the component side, they were starting to corrode. So fortunately this got caught in time before any major damage was done where circuit traces needed to be repaired. I was able to just go in with a fiberglass brush, clean it off, some isopropyl alcohol, clean the oil residue off of there, and it's fine now. So, like I say, it didn't need any repairs, but there is one little tip I can give on these radios, and that's why I'm starting the video in a strange place here. If you ever need to clean the controls in one of these, it's not like most radios. For starters, these radios, they're heavy. If you drop this thing on your foot, you might not. You'll still have a radio. Probably won't hurt the radio at all, in fact. But you might not have a foot left because it is a boat anchor. This thing is built like a tank. For starters, unlike most radios that have this appearance with this multi-level faceplate of the Cobras, this is not plastic. This is metal. It's a solid chunk of die-cast metal, the entire faceplate on these things. Once I get to put this thing back together, you'll also see all of the shielding material on this thing. You've got, the normal bracket that runs around the back and whatnot, but this has a solid metal plate that goes on the bottom, solid metal plate that goes on top of it, and then it slides into the wood cabinet. Yeah, they're just really heavy radios. Even, this plate on the bottom that covers this here, you can see how thick that is. Just look at the thickness of that metal. It's almost hard to flex, it's so thick. Yeah, I'm not going to say they spared no expense on these things, but yeah, this is back in the day that when they made radios, that was not their primary concern, was cost. Manufacturers always keep cost in mind because they can't produce something that no one will buy because it's too expensive. But yeah, this is back from an era when they made something, man, they made it to last. And like I say, you just need to be careful. Don't ever drop these things on your feet. But the controls. So the controls needed to be cleaned in this. Now, unlike most radios where if you take, the top or bottom covers or both, depending on the radio, what you're working on, to get in with your can of deoxit, to give the controls a shot, to give them, to clean them, you're not going to do that with one of these. Actually, you don't even have to take the radio out of the cabinet. So the wood cabinets this thing fits into, the top and bottom shield plates that encase the entire chassis here, you don't need to take any of that out. All you need to do is take 6 screws out of the speaker, because this fits right in here. Just take the 6 screws around the outside perimeter here to take this loose. Actually, the first thing you should do is, because you'll have the radio upside down here, the first thing you should do, take all the knobs off, and then take off all the nuts. Take off all the nuts, pull out all the washers, or they'll just fall out when you flip the radio back over. But the reason you need to do that is, unlike most radios where the controls just mount to the structure of the radio and then have wires running to them, they use a circuit board in these. So you can only clean a couple of them without taking it apart. So you take the nuts off, pull the washers out, flip the radio over, then take your 6 screws out of your speaker cover here, and then you can pull this board up and out, and you can see how all the controls are mounted to this circuit board. Like I say, you can get to like the back portion of this dual control. You can get to, you might be able to squeeze a little bit in like in the side here on this one, but that's about it. You really can't get to much in these. So it's not hard. Couple nuts, couple screws, just pull the board up. Then you can easily get down in here to clean your controls, put her back together, and you'll be good to go. And like I say, you don't even need to take the main cover off. It's just a matter of getting into the bottom side here. So let me get this put back together. I can get it flipped over, do the alignment on it, then I can show you exactly what this thing looks like from the top side. And like I say, I'll show you all the heavy-duty shielding plates on this, the armor plating this thing's built out of. I mean, even the side structure, I can just feel that that's like, I don't know, like 2 gauges thicker metal than, radios that were made just a few years later. So the later Cobra models, yeah, the sheet metal's like 2 gauges thinner. Excuse me. But, yep, just don't build them like they used to. So I shall return. Okay, so here we go on the top side. It's all done. Saw the clock just flipped over from 609 to 610. Like I said, it's one of the things that kind of makes this radio neat. It really has, I mean, the ones that have the rotary number dials on them, they're kind of cool, but nothing says retro like a flip clock. So, this one's in, like I say, really nice physical condition. The only real problem with it cosmetically is, and I've said this on other videos about the Cobra radios with this multi-level faceplate. It looks nice. It's actually kind of nice from a user's standpoint of using the controls, because some base stations, if the controls are down too low and you've got big meat paws, you may have trouble getting to some of those low knobs. Well, the knobs are up at an angle, so they're very easy to get to. But it's not perfectly flat, so it's not like you got to look straight down at it to see what they are. The only problem with this format is, if you ever are over top of this radio and drop something, what's it going to land on? The faceplate. It dents it. And that's the only thing I see wrong with this faceplate. There's a little dent right there, and a little dent right there. It may be hard to see in the camera, without me moving it to try to get the angle, but there's a little dent there and there. Other than that, it's mint. Like I say, it's solid metal. It's a die-cast metal faceplate. So, yeah, it just built like a tank. The covers, as I was saying, I grabbed them. They add a few more pounds to the radio, just the top and bottom plates. And, again, I'm not going to say they spared no expense, but things like grounding fingers, so this is meant to ground, because you have to remember, this faceplate here is metal. So what they're doing is, when you slide these cover plates in on the top and the bottom, these connect to make sure that there is good electrical connection between this metal faceplate and the actual chassis. These fingers come up and touch the inside. You usually don't see that in anything except for high-end electronic test equipment. Both of these covers have that. Like I say, again, that just costs money. You just don't see stuff like that in radios nowadays. And yeah, like I say, there's a top. This is actually the one for the top. And it even has cutouts to go around some stuff on the side. But yeah, they're just big, heavy, again, couple more pounds. Actually, what I'll do is I'll get it completely reassembled so you can see it just for a last little clip. What you can see it look like in the cabinet, because it's actually leaning backwards slightly because the back of the radio is about that much shorter than the bottom edge of this faceplate. So actually, the radio should be setting approximately like that is level. Actually, I can get rid of that. Anytime, and that's another thing, more modern radios, so radios made after this one, it's just something to keep in mind, especially if you're a tech and you're working on radios like this. They didn't take as much, I don't even know how to say this, caution? I don't know. They didn't design them with the tech in mind so much from a safety standpoint. Radios made after this, and you can think of the Cobra 2000 or the 142s, radios like that. Pretty much anything high voltage, meaning mains voltage, is on the bottom side. From the top side, there's really nothing you can touch inside the radio to get electrocuted. Radios like this aren't like that. There's fuses up here. The power socket is right there in the back. You could get your finger down in there, that top terminal, and bzz, yep, that's 120 volts there. There's 120 volts down here on the motor, so there's 120 volts in this area in here where the clock, because that's a 120 volt motor. So just, if you're working on stuff like this, especially when it comes time, when you're replacing parts, you don't have to worry about it. Hopefully you're smart enough to realize you need to unplug the radio before you go doing stuff like that. But when you're doing stuff like an alignment, you have a habit of, resting your hand on stuff, especially when you're trying to turn an alignment tool, because the trimmers and, a lot of these tunable transformers can be very, very touchy. Just the tiniest bit of rotation can mean a couple hundred hertz. So, you're trying to steady your hand. It's very easy to make the mistake of laying your arm across here, and there's 120 volts. So I always suggest, if you're working on something that has something to where just laying your hand on the top of the chassis could get you electrocuted, put an insulating material. Now what I'm using here it was actually like 2 or maybe 3 times as big as this originally. This is a hot glue pad. So if you got a hot glue gun, this is a pad that you're supposed to set it on, and then if the glue gets on it, it's easy to peel off. It's silicone rubber. Extremely high temperature resistant, but it's also an insulator. Non-scratchy because it's nice and rubbery. But yeah, it's easy to take something like this and just lay it on there. Now I can touch right there. There's 120 volts right there. I don't have to worry about getting electrocuted. Again, now if you're a tech, hopefully you also have, it's what this radio is running off of right now, is an isolation transformer like that. So I am isolated through that, but it's still, if you touch both sides of the mains, even when you have an isolation transformer, you're still going to get electrocuted because there is still 120 volts there, but just something to keep in mind. So here's the internals of the radio. Now actually it's kind of interesting. I actually have to turn it around here slightly. Again, watching your fingers. I'm not sure how well it will show up in the camera. Yeah, you can see it. The clock motors in these, there's actually a notch on each side. If you look at that, you can see that spinning right there. That's actually, you can hear that if I just touch that, maybe. That's actually rotating. So yeah, you can actually even see the flywheel, and that's basically what that is. They're using that as a kind of a flywheel weight for some centrifugal force. So once this thing fires up and gets running, it takes very little power to keep it going because it has that basically a heavy flywheel there. Yeah, it's kind of neat that you can actually see in the side of it. And if you ever get one of these radios and you like the flip clock, make sure the flip clock works. Because I'm not sure of a source for motors for these things. So if this clock dies, yeah, you're going to have a radio with a neat looking clock that doesn't work. Where the ones with the rotary dials used having a brain cramp here. Was it Schematic, I think, was the company that made the actual motors. They didn't make the clocks. I think it was Schematic. I'd have to look it up. But they made the clock motors that were used in those clock assemblies. Those clock motors can be repaired, and they fail very commonly. So like if you got a President Madison, I mean, Realistics, you name the radio, there were just dozens and dozens of radios, and pretty much every manufacturer that made base stations had a clock in at least one of their models of base station radios at some point. But the ones, like I say, they have the rotary dials, or number dials. What happens in those is, if you take the clock motor apart, the actual gear that sticks out of the motor, on the inside there's another gear, but it's kind of a soft plastic, it's almost rubbery, and that makes contact with another metal gear. That plastic deteriorates and it will crumble. And, you know, the motor is spinning, but the clock won't do anything. That's because all the teeth are stripped off. You can get rebuild kits for those. So, if you have one of those clocks, you can 99% of the time, as long as there's not something mechanically wrong with the clock itself. As long as it's just that, and it's pretty much every clock I've ever seen that didn't work. That's what the problem was that the plastic teeth on that one gear strip off. You can fix those. This one, not so much. Like I say, if this one breaks, yeah, you're just going to have a nice looking radio with a clock that doesn't do anything. So, you know, here's down inside the radio. Nice clean design. Now this is just like, this board was used in several radios, including Tram. So yeah, a lot of people, nothing beats a Tram, and nobody built radios like Tram. Well, yeah, even Tram towards the end wasn't making their own radios. They were just doing like everybody else. They were using circuit boards made by somebody else. And if you open up the Tram D, oh God, I'm miserable with model numbers. D60, what was that? 2, the mobile radio. I got a couple of blasted things. I'd have to go look at one. I think it's a D60, 62, something like that. It has this exact same chassis in it. Audio amp. Yeah, you can see the semiconductors, instead of the leads being bent at 90 degrees and being attached to heat sinks, they actually lay flat. So you've got the audio amp IC and, you know, regulators and whatnot, but you can see the leads go straight off to the side. Another thing when you do an alignment on one of these, you'll find, you know, if you've done a lot of alignments before, I'm not going to say this alignment is unique, but it is one of the more unique ones. It's kind of an odd, the procedure for doing an alignment on one of these radios. When you do you're aligning the PLL synthesizer circuit, you put the clarifier, you center your clarifier, and you will make all of your frequency adjustments. This radio is not like that. It's going to tell you to turn the clarifier full clockwise. Stick it on, you know, it's usually going to be either like channel 1 or 19, but it'll tell you, like, stick it on channel 1, AM. You know, at this test point, adjust for this frequency. Turn the clarifier fully counterclockwise. Turn to, you know, the other channel, 1 or 19. Adjust for another frequency. Center the clarifier. Make another adjustment. You want a different adjustment. Switch modes, turn the clarifier full counterclockwise or full clock, and yeah, it's a lot of button pressing and clarifier from full counterclockwise to full clockwise to centered. It's just a really strange arrangement. Part of the reason for that strange alignment procedure is this does not have a PLL in it, so it does not have a one-chip wonder. It is a phase-locked looped controlled radio, the synthesizer circuit, but it's not done with one IC. It's done actually, if we just grab the factory service manual here and have a gander at the schematic, and yes, there is lots of schematic for this thing. There's the power supply, here's most of the main chassis, and then the back 3 pages are the synthesizer circuit. So if we look at the schematic for the synthesizer circuit, we can see, where's my pointer at? Yeah, there is no one IC on here for the PLL. It's using a very early PLL synthesizer circuit, so it's made up of multiple ICs. You can see we have a phase comparator here. There's the oscillator preset divider here, phase comparator, and your programmable divider over here. And this is what actually attaches to the channel selector. But yeah, it's done with a couple ICs instead of using a one-chip wonder. And it's just the arrangement, the way that this was designed. Because of this, there are several frequency adjustments. They're all over the place. It has that really oddball alignment procedure. And it also makes, if you have troubles with the synthesizer circuit, it also makes troubleshooting it a little bit Well, I wouldn't even say more challenging. It makes it more interesting. It's kind of fun when one of these type synthesizers break, because you actually get to see what's going on inside of a PLL chip. Because this is done with a bunch of individual discrete ICs, you can actually probe at parts in this radio that you normally wouldn't be able to probe in a more modern radio that has a single IC in it. Because it's done with several different parts, what would normally be hidden inside of a block of epoxy, the actual IC, there's interconnects in between these ICs. So you can actually probe and see what's actually happening in those circuits. It just kind of, from a technical standpoint, like I say, it just makes it a little bit more interesting. Actually, somebody coming in very, very dead today. The airwaves are just silence. Somebody, a little bit of local truck traffic coming in on 19. And this has a very good receiver. I was actually very surprised. This is a good receiving radio. And the noise blanker A&L on these also works very well. You can hear that. There's the volume at halfway, so it's straight up and down. It has a very efficient A&L noise blanker. But yeah, like I say, man, it's just... it is skip-free. No sideband. I think even the locals gave up. Usually there's a couple guys on 38 lower sideband during the day. Locally around me, but yeah, it just... the deafening silence of crickets. except for a couple of local truckers every once in a while. But, so there you go. Let's see, is there any tips on these? Other tips that I could give? I don't think so. Like I say, good receiving radios. They're good quiet radios on sideband. Again, that's, thanks to like most older radios, a big crystal filter, so they have really good receivers. The capacitor on this, now this capacitor, the schematic calls for a 4700 microfarad capacitor here for the main filter capacitor. Now, there were some revisions over the years that they did to these chassis. One of those revisions was they increased the amount of filter capacitance. But instead of just installing a larger capacitor, like a 6800 microfarad, let's say, they left the original 4700, and actually it's in the trash can. I don't know or not my trash can, but it's down there in the recycle can somewhere. There it is. This is actually what it had in it. And, some people probably looking at it and think, oh man, that's a heck of a bodge job somebody did. No, that's not somebody, did it at a shop. This was done at the factory, because there's even the glue where they had these two capacitors glued together. But yeah, that was done from the factory. 4700 microfarad apparently wasn't quite enough filtering for this thing, so they tacked on, you can see that's a 4700, they tacked on an additional 2200 microfarad cap. Nowadays capacitors are physically a lot smaller, and to be able to reuse the original mounting bracket, I just stuck a 10,000 microfarad in there. So yeah, if you ever get one of these, with this doubled up, paralleled capacitors to get increased value, just stick in a modern 10,000, as long as you get the same can size, and then you can just reuse the mounting bracket to stick the cap right there. You don't have to come up with any ingenuitive and crazy way to mount the caps in there, since they're not actually mounted to the circuit board. So let me get this, get the shields put back on this thing. I'll get it slid back into the cabinet, and then you can see what it looks like all back together. Like I say, it cleaned up really nice. It was filthy. It definitely did not look anywhere close to this nice before. I don't know if you noticed when I was showing you how the controls, how to get to the controls, to clean them. The knobs that were sitting over here, yeah, they were brown. In all the grooves, they were just really funky, nasty. The faceplate was the same way. Just had a lot of dirt. Not scratched up. It had what I call the protective film. Once you clean the protective film off, nice clean faceplate underneath to be seen. But anyhow, let me get her back in the cabinet, and then you can take a look and see what she looks like all back together. And just really quick before I get the wooden cabinet slid back on, so there you can see, yeah, nice solid radio. And then, as you can see, all the grounding fingers, what they're meant to do is, like I said, they're meant to attach the chassis. So all of this, are we out of focus? Focus, focus, focus. There we go. That's meant to keep your chassis electrically connected to the faceplate. So, this thing doesn't accidentally become floating on its own at a different ground potential by having these fingers here, all those fingers up against that faceplate. That helps to connect that to the chassis. And one thing, before you slide, if you work on one of these, I'd try to do this to most radios, especially stuff like this where there's a lot of exposed steel. You got to remember your fingers. Even if you go wash your hands and immediately come in, there's still oils and salts and just all kinds of nasty corrosive stuff to your fingers. So to prevent this from blooming into a pile of rust, 30 plus years from now, I've shown it before, it doesn't have to be this, I like using gun oil because it has corrosion inhibitors in it that are meant for, use for long-term storage on guns. Well, steel, same thing. Just spray a little bit of that on a microfiber towel and just lightly wipe down the entire steel chassis, anything, before you slide it back into the cabinet. That'll apply a light coating of the corrosion inhibitor and should prevent your fingerprints. If you come back a year from now, you won't see a big paw print there on the sheet metal. So let me stop the video, get her slid back into the cabinet. I got to wipe down the entire thing, and then you can have a look at the reassembled radio. Okay, and there we go, all back together and ready to box up and send back to the customer. Like I say, the cabinet was in really nice shape on this one. So other than it did have that protective film on it, so the dirt layer, got that cleaned off, waxed the cabinet. So yeah, just a really nice looking radio with the exception of 2 little dents here on the faceplate. Like I say, they really don't even show up much in the camera. There is a light for the clock. Now I've known some people over the years. They'll take these clocks and put really bright lights in them. I don't recommend that. They put dim bulbs in there for a reason. It's not meant... In the middle of the day, they're huge numbers. You can see them. You don't need any illumination to see the numbers of that clock. The problem is at night. If you put extremely bright light bulbs in there, you're going to have basically a flashlight turned on in whatever room this radio sets in. As long as it's plugged in, the meter lights, none of this stuff will be on, but anytime the radio's plugged in, the clock is running, so the clock's illuminated. And if you put really bright light bulbs in there, well, basically you now have a flashlight in your room. Now, what they used in these was a neon bulb. It's really, really dim, but it's actually perfect. So in a dark room at night, it has a nice little faint orange glow that comes up over the clock face, and it just looks cool. You've got the retro clock with a retro, neon bulb in there. It's like an NE2 sized bulb. I'm trying to see if I can get it, if I shield the light here. There, you can just see it. That little bit of glow. It doesn't show up very well in the camera, but you can get the idea. But it actually sits right down here at the bottom, just in front of the digits. But yeah, like I said, I always recommend leaving stuff like that as it was intended. They put a dim bulb in there for a reason. That way you didn't have a spotlight at nighttime, glowing out of the radio. It's just enough that if you look over at it, even from across the room at nighttime, there's plenty of illumination there. So, in any case, there you go. A Cobra 135 XLR, all back together and ready to send back to the customer.